$42,000. That is the approximate share of public debt every American citizen, man, woman, and child, inherited the moment the Treasury's borrowing clock surged past $34 trillion. Most of us don't feel it yet. It doesn't arrive as a formal bill in your mailbox or a deduction on your pay stub. Instead, it's a silent, invisible weight, a hidden tax on every gallon of gas and every bag of groceries you buy to keep your family fed. We are conditioned by the news cycle to fear the sudden strike, the kinetic war, the Black Swan cyber attack, the total grid blackout. But the most lethal blades in human history don't always draw blood. Often, they are made of ink and compounding interest. History books tell a sanitized, heroic lie about the end of the samurai. They claim the warrior class met its end at the tip of a bayonet during the Meiji Restoration. It makes for a great Hollywood epic, but the truth is far more clinical and far more terrifying. Long before the first Gatling gun arrived in Edo, the fiercest warrior caste in human history had already been bled dry by a ledger. They were caught in a samurai trap that mirrors our own 2026 fiscal wall with terrifying precision. Under current policy trajectories, the United States is on a course where, by the end of 2026, the net interest payments on our national debt are projected by the Congressional Budget Office to eclipse our entire defense budget. Think about the gravity of that statement. We are entering an era where we spend more on the ghost of money already gone, money used to fund past mistakes in previous generations, than we do on the actual hardware and personnel meant to protect our future. This isn't just a budget line. It's a total transfer of sovereignty from the state to the lenders. In the Edo period, this exact mechanism turned the masters of the sword into slaves of the scale. To maintain their lavish alternate attendance lifestyles, the samurai began pledging their future rice harvests to urban merchants. By the mid-1800s, the men who once ruled through terror were working as glorified security guards for the very creditors who owned their homes. Today, the mechanism has moved from the rice brokers of Osaka to the high-frequency trading floors of Manhattan. As the FDIC monitors hundreds of billions in unrealized losses sitting on bank balance sheets, the ghost of Tokusei-rei, the ancient nuclear option of forced debt cancellation, is whispering through the halls of the Treasury. You are witnessing the final months of a cycle that has destroyed every empire that dared to ignore the math. The sword didn't fail the samurai. The ledger did. And by 2026, that ledger is coming for you. If you take the high-speed rail from Tokyo to Kyoto today, you aren't just traveling through space. You're moving through a landscape carved by the ghosts of the daimyo. To keep the peace after centuries of civil war, the shogun didn't use iron cages or secret police. He used real estate and mandatory consumerism. Under the Sankin Kotai system, every regional lord was forced to maintain a massive estate in Edo, modern-day Tokyo, while traveling back and forth in gold-plated processions that cost a fortune. It was a financial death sentence disguised as a tradition. It was designed to bleed the ruling class of their liquid assets so they would never have enough capital to fund a rebellion. Now look at your own driveway. Under current economic trajectories, the average American is paying over $700 a month for a vehicle that loses 10% of its value the second it hits the pavement. Like the samurai marching to Edo to prove their status, we are caught in a cycle of high-status consumption funded by debt we don't actually own. The shogunate knew a fundamental truth about human nature. A warrior who is worried about his mortgage is a warrior who won't start a revolution. Today, with total household debt climbing toward $18 trillion according to Federal Reserve data, that feudal sinkhole has been recreated with digital precision. We are retainers to our own lifestyles. By the mid-Edo period, the samurai were so desperate to maintain appearances that they began borrowing against rice harvests that hadn't even been planted yet. They were literally selling their future to pay for their present. This is the exact psychological wall the American consumer has hit in 2026. According to recent Treasury data, we are facing a maturity wall where roughly $9 trillion of government debt must be refinanced over the next few years at significantly higher interest rates. This isn't just a government problem, it's a us problem. When the cost of that debt spikes, the status march for the middle class ends. The merchants of Edo eventually realized that the samurai's honor was a depreciating asset. When the warriors could no longer pay the interest, the merchants simply stopped providing the silk, the rice, and the luxury. The system didn't just slow down, it seized. In 2026, we are reaching that same friction point. If the global market decides that the American status march is no longer a safe bet, the credit that fuels our cars, our homes, and our very sense of self will evaporate. The shogun's trap didn't require a single bullet. It only required the target to keep buying things they couldn't afford until the ledger finally snapped shut. Walk into the Dojima Rice Exchange in 17th century Osaka, and you aren't looking at a marketplace. You're looking at the birthplace of the phantom economy. This was the world's first futures market. Here, merchants, men technically ranked at the absolute bottom of the social ladder, invented empty rice receipts. They weren't trading grain anymore. They were trading promises. While the samurai stayed frozen in a rigid code of honor and physical land ownership, the merchants realized that the person who controls the medium of exchange eventually controls the person who holds the sword. By 1750, the ledger had officially become mightier than the katana. The hierarchy was supposed to be set in stone. Warriors at the top, then farmers, then artisans, and finally, the parasitic merchants at the bottom. But the math didn't care about the social order. Because the samurai were paid in rice but had to live in a world that demanded cash, they became entirely dependent on the brokers to convert their stipends. These brokers charged exorbitant fees and offered predatory advances. It's the same financialization we've seen hollow out the American Midwest. Since the 1980s, the U.S. financial sector has mutated from a service that supports industry into the engine that dictates it. We stopped making things and started moving symbols around, just like the Osaka brokers. By the mid-1700s, the secret was out. Almost every major samurai family was underwater, owing 20 or 30 years of their future income to these merchant houses. They were technically elites, but practically indentured servants. Fast forward to our current reality. The Federal Reserve's most recent Z1 report shows the financial sector's claims on the rest of the economy are at historic, suffocating highs. We are living in an era where the lenders are the new shoguns. They don't need to pass laws. They just need to adjust the cost of credit. When the interest on the national debt hits that 2026 milestone, the government effectively loses its seat at the head of the table. Consider the sheer gravity of the 2026 projections. When interest payments eclipse the defense budget, the Pentagon, the modern equivalent of the samurai warrior class, becomes a secondary priority to the bondholders. We are witnessing a total transfer of power. In Edo, Japan, the merchants eventually grew so powerful they started buying samurai status, merging the debtor and the creditor into a single, untouchable ruling class. Today, we call that the revolving door between Wall Street and Washington. It's the same parasitic bloom occurring 3 centuries apart, feeding on a host that is too proud to admit it's already been conquered. The merchant didn't need to fight the samurai. He just needed to wait for the interest to compound. In 2026, the wait is over. The empty rice receipts of the past have become the unrealized losses on modern bank balance sheets, and the bill is coming due for everyone. The financial system is designed to keep you in the dark, but history provides the map to escape the trap. If this insight opened your eyes, hit the like button to help us break through the noise. Share this with someone who needs to see the patterns before the next collapse, and subscribe to master the mechanics of wealth that they don't want you to understand. Don't let your purchasing power disappear in silence. Drop a comment below, and let's discuss the truth the 1% ignores. The year is 1789. Imagine the silence in the streets of Edo when the shogunate's criers posted the decree. It was called tokusei, literally, acts of benevolent government. With a single stroke of a brush, the government did the unthinkable. They declared all debts owed by the samurai retainers to the merchant class null and void. It was a financial rapture. To the struggling warrior, it felt like a miracle. To the merchant who had spent decades building a ledger of credit, it was state-sponsored theft. This wasn't a policy. It was a desperate, one-time hack to keep the ruling class from losing their homes. But benevolence has a price that doesn't show up on the day of the announcement. The secret of tokusei is that it only works if you never plan on borrowing money ever again. The moment the debt was erased, the credit markets of Japan froze solid. Merchants, realizing their contracts were nothing more than suggestions, simply stopped lending. If the state could erase debt once, they would do it again. The flow of capital evaporated. To keep the economy moving, the shogunate had to resort to the 18th century version of the printing press, currency debasement. They called back the gold coins and melted them down, mixing in cheap copper and lead to stretch the supply. This is where the ghost of the 1700s meets the modern halls of the Federal Reserve. We don't call it tokusei anymore. We call it quantitative easing or debt jubilee. When the system becomes so top-heavy that the interest cannot be paid, the state is forced to choose between the lenders and the stability of the enforcers. In the U.S., we are fast approaching our own 2026 reset moment. As the Treasury prepares to roll over trillions of dollars in short-term debt at rates 3 times higher than they were 5 years ago, the whisper of a structured default or inflationary wipeout is no longer just a conspiracy theory. It is a mathematical necessity. The consequence of the samurai's reset was a catastrophic spike in the price of basic goods, classic inflation. Because there were more debased coins chasing fewer goods, the cost of living doubled while the samurai's erased debt was replaced by an inability to buy food. Today, the BIS and the IMF monitor sovereign risk with the same nervous eyes those Osaka merchants had. If the U.S. government uses inflation to cancel the real value of its debt by 2026, it is effectively issuing a modern tokusei. You might wake up with your student loans or your mortgage nominally managed, but you'll find that your paycheck no longer buys the calories needed to survive the week. When you break the trust of the merchants, the global bondholders who fund the American lifestyle. The credit window doesn't just crack, it slams shut. In Edo, the warriors got their benevolence, and within a decade, they were eating their own horses. We are standing on the edge of that same nuclear reset, and the 2026 maturity wall is the countdown timer. Hold a gold Koban coin from the early 1600s in your hand, and you're holding 85% pure gold. It has weight. It has truth. But by the 1860s, the Manon-era coins were a joke. Shrunken, flimsy tokens with a gold content of barely 15%. The shogunate hadn't just run out of money, they had run out of honesty. To pay for their ballooning deficits and the crushing cost of the Sankin Kotai system, the government staged a series of recoinages. They called in the old, heavy money and handed back new coins mixed with lead and copper. It was the silent killer of the samurai class. They were still being paid the same amount of rice, but that rice now bought 70% less than it did a generation prior. This is the exact point where history stops being a lesson and starts being a mirror. Since the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, the US dollar has lost over 97% of its purchasing power. But while that was a slow crawl for decades, we've just lived through a violent sprint. Between 2020 and 2024, the M2 money supply surged by nearly 35%. Just like the shoguns mixing lead into the gold, the US Treasury and the Fed flooded the system with digital debasement to cover the costs of a global shutdown and a soaring national debt. The result is the same. The fixed income of the modern American, the salaryman and the retiree, is being vaporized by the cost of eggs, gas, and rent. We are now hurtling toward the 2026 mathematical wall. This isn't a political talking point. It's a ledger reality. By 2026, the Congressional Budget Office, CBO projections, show a terrifying convergence. The combination of Social Security outlays and the net interest on the national debt is set to consume the vast majority of all federal tax revenue. Think about that. Before a single dollar is spent on roads, schools, or the military, the interest and entitlements have already emptied the vault. In the late Edo period, this was the moment of goke reijo, when the laws were ignored because the money was worthless. The samurai didn't understand why they were starving despite having piles of official currency. They didn't see the base metals being stirred into the melting pots in the dark corners of the mint. Today, the debasement is more sophisticated. It's hidden in real interest rates and inflation adjustments that don't match the reality at the grocery store. By 2026, when the U.S. Treasury must refinance 1/3 of its total debt at these new punishing rates, the only way to pay the bill will be more debasement, more mixing of the metals. The silent killer is no longer silent. It's screaming through the price of every asset you own. Just as the samurai eventually realized their honor couldn't be traded for bread, the American public is waking up to the fact that their dollars are becoming Manon coins, tokens of a system that is choosing its own survival over the value of your labor. The blade hasn't swung yet, but you can hear the whetstone. Why is 2026 the year the floor falls out? In the Edo period, the shogunate's collision course was driven by the nengu, the rice tax. For centuries, the shogun squeezed the farmers, demanding up to 50 or even 60% of their annual harvest. But there is a biological limit to how much a man can give before he starves. By the early 1800s, the farmers reached that limit. They stopped producing for the state and started hiding their yields or simply abandoning the land. The shogunate was left with a massive administrative overhead and a shrinking tax base. They were the world's most powerful bureaucracy, and they were running on empty. In the United States, we are hitting our own biological limit, but it's being triggered by a legislative time bomb. As we sit here in 2026, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, TCJA of 2017, has officially expired. For the average American family, this isn't just a policy shift. It's a sudden, violent contraction of their take-home pay. Standard deductions have been slashed, and tax brackets have shifted upward. Just like the Edo farmers, the American middle class is being asked to pay more into a system that is providing less. But here is the forensic truth. Even if the IRS squeezed every penny from every citizen, it wouldn't be enough. We've entered the interest death spiral. The math is brutal. In 2024, the Treasury spent roughly $890 billion on interest. By this year, 2026, that number has surged past the $1.1 trillion mark. We are now spending more on the ghost of past debt than we are on the current defense of the nation. This is the moment the rice tax failed the shogun. When the cost of maintaining the debt exceeds the cost of maintaining the state becomes a subsidiary of its creditors. The CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, warned us about this fiscal cliff, but we treated it like a political football. Now the ball has turned into a lead weight. The producers, the small business owners, the engineers, the truckers are looking at their tax bills and realizing they are working 4 months out of the year just to pay the interest on a loan they never signed for. In Edo, this realization led to the flight of the peasantry. In 2026 America, it's leading to the shadow economy and capital flight. When the Internal Revenue Service's struggles to meet revenue targets collide with mandatory spending on Social Security and Medicare, the collision course ends in a total wreckage of the social contract. The shogun thought he could simply order the farmers to produce more. He was wrong. The U.S. government thinks it can simply vote to raise the debt ceiling forever. But 2026 is the year the math stops listening to the votes. The interest death spiral is the modern-day equivalent of a failed harvest. A systemic collapse where the more you tax, the less you receive, and the closer you get to the edge of the blade. In the twilight of the Edo period, a strange phenomenon began to rot the social hierarchy from the inside out. Wealthy merchants, men like the House of Mitsui, stopped merely lending money and started buying the one thing money wasn't supposed to be able to buy: lineage. They purchased samurai status for their sons, marrying into bankrupt noble families and blurring the line between the producer and the protector. The secret of the 1800s was that the shogunate had been hollowed out. The men wearing the swords were now owned, body and soul, by the men holding the ledgers. The regulators had become regulated. Today, the bond vigilantes are the modern-day Mitsuis. These aren't just guys in suits at Goldman Sachs. They are the massive sovereign wealth funds and the institutional whales at BlackRock and Vanguard who decide if the United States is good for it. In late 2024 and through 2025, we watched as these vigilantes began demanding a higher term premium, essentially a combat pay for lending to a government that can't stop spending. When foreign central banks, from Tokyo to Beijing, began trimming their holdings of U.S. treasuries, they weren't just making a trade. They were casting a vote of no confidence. By 2026, these lenders have effectively become the modern shoguns, dictating domestic policy through the threat of a sell-off. The shift is now complete. In Edo, the merchants bought the status. In 2026 America, we have the corporatocracy. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a structural reality. Look at the data from the Bank for International Settlements, BIS. The line between the regulators, the shogunate, and the lenders, the merchants, has vanished. We see a revolving door where Treasury officials come from the very firms that profit from government debt issuance. Just as the Edo merchants eventually sat on the shogun's councils, the modern merchant kings now draft the very legislation, like the Basel III endgame rules or capital requirement adjustments, that ensures their survival over the stability of the currency. This is the ultimate merger. When the lender and the lawmaker become one and the same, the public interest is discarded for interest payments. In the 1860s, the samurai realized too late that their lords were actually employees of the Osaka rice brokers. In 2026, the American public is waking up to the same reality. Your representative might vote on a budget, but the bond vigilantes decide if that budget is allowed to exist. We have returned to a feudal state where the merchant doesn't just fund the kingdom, he owns the crown. If the lenders decide to walk in 2026, no amount of military might can stop the collapse. The sword cannot cut a debt, and the shogunate of Washington is finding out that once you sell your status to the merchant, you never truly get it back. In the late 1830s, the Tenpo famine wasn't just a weather event, it was a policy failure. While the granaries were empty, the shogunate kept taxes high to service the debts of the elite. This triggered the Ikki, explosive, violent peasant uprisings that turned the countryside into a war zone. These weren't idealistic revolutionaries fighting for democracy or liberty. These were hungry men and women with nothing left to lose. They attacked the pawn shops and the rice merchants, tearing up the debt ledgers first. They realized that the secret of their misery wasn't just a bad harvest. It was a system that prioritized the interest payments of the shogun over the survival of the producer. Fast forward to the American landscape of 2026. We are tracking a set of data points known as social stress indicators. This isn't just about the consumer price index. It's about the misery index, the combination of underemployment and the cost of essential survival. In 2024 and 2025, the real wages of the American working class were effectively neutralized by shadow inflation, the skyrocketing cost of insurance, childcare, and utilities that the official government stats often downplay. By 2026, the warrior class, the blue-collar workers and the service industry, is hitting the same wall the Edo farmers hit. They are realizing the American dream hasn't just been deferred, it's been sold to pay for the debt. The parallel is chilling. In Edo, the uprisings targeted the merchants of greed. Today, that anger is directed at the institutions. When a nation spends more on interest than it does on its own infrastructure or military, it sends a clear signal to its people. Your future is being liquidated to pay for our past. This is the moment stability evaporates. When the cost of a starter home in a modest suburb requires a salary that puts you in the top 10% of earners, the social contract isn't just frayed, it's a provocation. Historical social stress indicators, used by researchers like Peter Turchin, show that elite overproduction and popular immiseration lead to a structural breakdown. In 2026, we have both. We have an elite class fighting over a shrinking pie, and a working class that can no longer afford the basic calories of the American life. This is the modern Ikki. It doesn't always start with pitchforks. It starts with quiet quitting, then massive labor disruptions, and finally, the breakdown of civil order in the urban centers. The fire that started in the Edo rice fields is flickering in the eyes of the American workforce, and this time, there are no more ledgers left to burn. The Boshin War of 1868 is often painted as a clash of ideologies, the traditional sword against the modern rifle. But if you follow the money, it was a mass resignation of the state's security forces. The secret of 1868 is that the Tokugawa shogunate didn't fall because it was outgunned. It fell because its checks were bouncing. For years, the shogun had been borrowing from the stipends of his own soldiers. By the time the imperial rebels from Satsuma and Choshu marched on Edo, the average samurai retainer hadn't seen a full inflation-adjusted paycheck in a decade. When the Meiji Emperor's faction offered a new financial start, backed by a fresh consortium of merchants, the fierce warriors didn't fight to the death for their masters. They simply walked away. This is the ultimate lesson of history that no politician wants to discuss. A government that cannot pay its debts eventually loses its monopoly on violence. The state is only as powerful as its ability to compensate the men and women who enforce its laws. In the late Edo period, the shogunate's bankruptcy led to Ronin-ism, thousands of unemployed armed men wandering the country, no longer bound by loyalty to a bankrupt center. In 2026, the United States is testing this exact boundary. As the interest on our debt consumes the budget, the first thing to get optimized or deferred is often the very thing that keeps the lights on: military readiness, police pensions, and the maintenance of the rule of law. The 2026 interest-to-defense flip is a psychological threshold. When the Pentagon's budget, projected to be roughly $850 billion, is dwarfed by $1.1 trillion in interest payments to bondholders, the message to the rank and file is clear. The system is serving the creditors, not the defenders. We are already seeing the cracks. Recruiting shortfalls in the U.S. military hit historic lows in recent years, driven by a real-world realization that the compensation doesn't match the inflation-adjusted cost of living. Just as the samurai realized their honor was being used to subsidize a bankrupt shogun, modern service members are looking at an economy where a housing allowance doesn't cover a two-bedroom apartment. When the monopoly on violence breaks, it doesn't always look like a civil war. It looks like institutional rot. It's the veteran who can't get health care, the officer who quits for a private security gig, and the specialist who takes his skills to the highest bidder. In 1868, the shogunate's collapse was a default in the truest sense. A default on the social contract with the people who held the weapons. As we cross the 2026 threshold, the U.S. government faces the same existential threat. You can print money to pay a bondholder, but you cannot print loyalty. Once the warriors realize the samurai trap has snapped shut on them, the authority of the state becomes nothing more than a ghost in the machine. We have spent 25 minutes tracing a ghost from the streets of 19th century Edo to the marble halls of the modern Federal Reserve. The cycle isn't just repeating, it's accelerating. 2026 is the year the interest trap finally snaps shut. This is the year the math becomes undeniable. When you realize that every hour you work is increasingly diverted to service a debt incurred before you were born, you are no longer a citizen in a representative democracy. You are a retainer in a neo-feudal estate. The samurai debt secret wasn't that they were poor. It was that they were irrelevant, because they had lost control of their own ledger. The history of the Edo period shows us that you cannot simply delete debt without deleting the social order that sustained it. When the shogunate tried to wipe the slate clean, they didn't save the system, they destroyed the trust that allowed the system to function. As we look at the 2026 horizon, history suggests there are only 3 ways out of the samurai trap. The first is hyperinflation, the total debasement of the currency until the debt is nominally paid, but the money is worthless. The second is default, a modern tokusei where the government simply refuses to pay, shattering the global financial system and ending the dollar's reign as the reserve currency. The third is revolution, a fundamental restructuring of the social contract driven by the ikki of a population that can no longer afford to live. The survival guide for 2026 isn't about hoarding gold bars or moving to a bunker. It's about a radical shift in your personal monopoly on violence, which in the 21st century is your monopoly on value. You must move your labor and your assets away from the shadow receipts of the modern merchants. Look at the data from the BIS and the Fed's own H8 reports. The traditional banking system is increasingly a warehouse for government debt. To survive the snap, you must become your own shogun. Diversify into hard assets. Eliminate personal lifestyle creep that functions as your own sankenkotai, and realize that the state's benevolence is usually a prelude to a haircut. The sword didn't fail the samurai. They were still the most skilled warriors on the planet the day the shogunate collapsed. They failed because they believed the ledger was someone else's problem. They thought their status protected them from the math. It didn't. As we cross the threshold of 2026, the interest on our debt has become the new master of our house. We are living through the final pages of a 600-year-old script. The blade is mid-swing. The only question left is where you will be standing when it finally hits the floor. The sword didn't fail the samurai. The ledger did. Don't let the ledger fail you.